Skillshare class, the most comprehensive and detailed one I've created to date. It's designed so we can walk through a simple layering system that will allow you to achieve a vibrant, realistic result, taking full advantage of the transparent qualities of this medium and really capturing the spirit of the flower. If we haven't met yet, my name is Anna. I'm a Canadian designer and creator of all things beautiful and intricate. From Canadian money to best-selling book covers, and of course lots and lots of vibrant botanicals. That's what I specialize in: hyper-realistic flowers in watercolor and ink, and they often appear on Canadian silver dollar coins, sometimes even surrounded by real diamonds. So if you love watercolor, you know a few basic techniques already, and you want to level up your skills or simply practice more advanced techniques with me, this class would be great for you. We will paint in real time, start to finish, so you can follow my every brush stroke. I will be pointing out areas on the reference photo that we're focusing on, explaining my color choices and direction of the brush stroke. And the key things we will practice in this class include glazing, which is planning and building transparent layers of pigment to create deeper, realistic tones. Creating a sense of light on a two-dimensional plane by making an underpainting on our flower and carefully building the shadows around our areas of light. We will also take a deep dive into our pigments, learning a simple structure that you can use to organize and select your pigments. Class materials include a black and white outline that I created for you so you can trace the drawing onto your watercolor paper, and it's simplified to include major petal shapes, a list of supplies including some alternatives that I love and trust, a high-resolution reference photo of the pink peony, as well as a selection of additional reference photos from my library so you can continue practicing on your own using all the techniques we cover in this class, and a light and shadow diagram to help you build your palette for any botanical subject. By the end of this class, you will have a gorgeous painting that you can frame and be proud of. More importantly, you will be able to apply the watercolor techniques we use on any flower of your choice. So let's get started. If you have any questions, you can reach out to me through Skillshare website by posting a new discussion in the discussion section of this class. And don't forget to follow me on Skillshare if you want to stay up to date on my upcoming classes. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Welcome to the class. I'm so happy to see you. Before we start, let's quickly go over the materials and supplies we will need. The most important thing we will need for this class is watercolor paper. Professional watercolor paper like this, 140 pounds or even thicker. You can go up to 300. You really want to get thick paper because we're going to put down 3 layers of color, and you want to make sure that your watercolor paper can absorb this amount of water without buckling. If you've seen any of my previous classes, you know that I don't stretch my paper. I prefer to use watercolor blocks, which look like this. It's just a bunch of sheets glued on the side. You can paint on the top sheet of paper and then peel it off when you're ready. This way you can avoid the stretching process. I'm not going to go into much detail on the stretching. There are lots of good classes on this channel and also on YouTube. I recommend, for example, Louis Demassi's class on stretching watercolor paper. In terms of the type of paper, I prefer cold pressed versus hot pressed, simply because the way it absorbs water. So with hot pressed paper, it's a lot more smooth and water tends to sort of sit on top of the surface, whereas with cold pressed, it gets absorbed fairly quickly, and I like the slightly textured look of it as well. In terms of the brushes, it's really simple. What you will need is just 2 round brushes. You can either use real or synthetic, sable or squirrel, and what I ended up using is this Escoda Reserva, which is the real sable brush, and this one is in size 4. You can probably use something like size 6 as well. And for smaller details that we're going to do on layer 2 and 3, I ended up going with this Winsor & Newton, also sable, also round brush, It's a little bit more pointy, it's smaller, and so it's size 2. You may want to go with something like size 2 or 3 if you have a synthetic, and even smaller if you have real sable. We'll need a palette, of course, and I prefer porcelain palettes because they don't absorb paint as much as plastics do, and you can really see what your mixture is going to look like on paper when you pre-mix it on a porcelain palette. We'll need some water. Typically, it's better to have 2 jars of water because you want to have one where you clean your brush and then the second one where you give your brush another bath to make sure that there's no residual color. But in this case, we're working primarily with pinks, so I think just 1 jar of water will do. In order to create your outline, I recommend hard pencil, something like 2H or 4H, and you can find that on the side of the pencil usually. This indicates how much graphite will be left on paper as you're drawing. And the reason why you want to use hard pencil versus something soft is because you really want to leave really light marks on your paper so you don't have to erase much, and if you do need to erase, you can just easily pick up the graphite marks. And speaking of erasers, I do prefer retractable erasers, very thin, so that when you're putting the eraser on paper, you're only picking up the lines that you're aiming to pick up and not ruining the texture of the paper too much. You will probably need 1 or 2 pieces of tissue paper just to dry your brush as we're painting. There will also be a couple of cases where we will be lifting watercolor paint as we're painting to create some highlights. And so what you want to do is have a semi-dry brush for that. And the only thing that's necessary is just to clean the brush and then dab it on your tissue paper before you lift paint. Finally, in terms of optional but highly recommended materials, we will need some masking fluid, and I'm using usually this Winsor & Newton. It's called Art Masking Fluid. It's a little bit yellow, so it's visible when you're working with it on white paper. And in terms of the applicator, I prefer rubber color shapers, but you can use an old brush or a matchstick. The reason why we need to use masking fluid is because we have a few clusters of light yellow stamens in the middle of the flower, and so it's a lot easier to cover them with masking fluid before we start, so we can go in with our pinks and not worry about getting into those areas where the stamens are visible. Now, if you don't have masking fluid, please don't let this stop you. You can simply paint around the stamens very carefully, and if you accidentally get into that area that's supposed to be yellow with your pinks, you can always use white gouache or yellow gouache after the entire painting is done. And that's it in terms of the supplies. Now, in the next video, we're going to talk about our pigments and how to organize our palette. In order to paint our peony, we will need 5 main pigments for the petals and 2 for the stems and stamens. There are 2 optional pigments as well to add some depth and variation to our painting. In the class handout, you will find a detailed description of each pigment along with a list of potential alternatives from the brands I use and trust. You can look for some other similar pigments in your palette. Don't let my list limit you. Use it as a general guide. This diagram, which you probably know by now if you've taken any of my previous classes, will help us organize our pigments and will help you look for alternatives if you need to. Here's a version of this diagram adopted for our peony specifically. So in terms of the main pigments, we will need a base color, and by base I mean pigments that are going to be used almost on the entire surface of each petal. And from this pigment we will build up and down around the color spectrum. I'm going to use Opera Pink from Daniel Smith. Winsor & Newton calls it Opera Rose. It's the most fluorescent pink you can possibly find in watercolor sets, and it's the closest in terms of the color to the reference photo. We will use it primarily in the first layer to establish a light background wash, and we will use a more saturated version of it in our next layers to add some vibrancy. Please note, this is important. Opera pink is highly fugitive, meaning it will fade if you leave it in direct sunlight. We're not talking about days or weeks, but after a year or two, it will definitely lose its vibrancy. I don't mind using this color in my professional work that ends up digitized for patterns or dollar coins or surface design because it's so beautiful. However, if you're painting something that you plan to sell as an original to be hanging on the wall, you may want to consider a light, fast, non-fugitive pigment. Of course, you will lose the vibrancy. However, the resulting painting will be much more resistant to fading. I recommend Quinacridone Rose from Daniel Smith, and here I'm actually painting the same peony with this Quinacridone Rose as base color instead of Opera Pink. And you can see that it's a lot more muted, but I thought it was important to mention and show you. Again, if you're painting with the goal of learning and maybe eventually hanging the work in your room with no direct sunlight, perhaps under UV glass, then I wouldn't worry too much and go for the bright Opera Pink. It's absolutely lovely. Regardless of the base pink you choose, our boost color will be magenta, and I will use Quinacridone Magenta from Core, as Core pigments give the most vibrant results in my experience because they use a different type of binder compared to other watercolors. You can use Daniel Smith Magenta as well for a very similar effect. It's also super vibrant. We will use it on top of our pink in the second and third layers, and it will help us achieve a more realistic effect. Then we will need a color for the tips of our petals. Thin part that's almost at the edge, that's almost white, but has some translucent pigment there. We will use purple mixed with lots and lots of water there. You can substitute for warm blue if you want. I will be using Dioxazine Purple because it's my favorite color in the world, but there are some alternatives you will find in the class handout. Lastly, we'll need a warm yellow, and I will be using Benzo Yellow from Core, but any basic warm yellow will do. This is truly optional if you want to capture the warm glow of the sun that is being reflected on the right at the base of some petals. We need to create a layer underneath. This underpainting will be under our pink layer of color. Now, supporting pigments we will need are warm red, for those petals where the inside roots are visible, and I'm using Quinacridone Red. You can use Carmine or another deep red you have in your palette. For cooler shadows we will need violet. You can reuse your purple here if you don't have a violet, or mix your own with pink and purple. It's for those petals where we see the lower back. As an option, you may want to add even a deeper violet brown for the darkest shadows. It will help add some contrast, some saturation, and a sense of realism and variation in your pigments. This is optional. I'm using Perylene Maroon, which is sort of a deep brick red color. You can use Perylene Violet as well, or some sort of deeper brown. My Perylene Maroon is from Daniel Smith. For stamens, as a base, you can reuse the warm yellow from your underpainting, and to add more definition to those yellow stamens, you can use either some light violet. I'm going to be using Perylene Maroon. You can use brown or olive green. For the stem, we will need two greens, a light, warm, and a cool, deep green. If you only have one green on hand, you will need to mix it with your yellow for the lighter parts and use the deeper green for the darker parts. That's all. Again, you can review the handout at any point. I will be naming the pigments as I paint each petal in real time, and if you don't have those specific pigments that I've mentioned or the alternatives that I have in my handout, feel free to use some other pigments that you have in your palette and just follow the general logic of the palette that we've established. Before we start painting, I wanted to give you a quick overview of our process from start to finish so you can feel confident at every stage and know what to expect. This is very important as we plan our painting as a series of layers. It's called glazing, and it involves building transparent layers of pigment to modify the values and the appearance of color on the final painting, creating deeper tones and sometimes changing the colors completely. From a very soft background color with almost no detail to more detailed saturated layers. This is how we can achieve this realistic look with watercolors step by step. That is not to say that we can't have a one layer peony painting. That's one way of doing it, and it may be nice to have some loose transparent color transitions without much detail. But if you want to achieve a more precise look, we'll need to plan it in stages and start with a big color wash, progressing to more finer details. So as an optional but highly recommended first step, we will cover the yellow stamens with masking fluid so we can freely paint our pink petals without worrying about covering the stamens accidentally. Our first layer of color, our background layer, will feature only light pinks and purples, and I mean super light. We will paint petal by petal, and I will explain my color choices. In terms of the technique, we will use wet on wet for our first layer. This is a basic watercolor technique, which means you wet the area, you're going to paint first, and then very quickly add additional colors where necessary before it's completely dry. You kind of mix the colors directly on paper and letting them blend. Feel free to use your larger brush here. I'm going to be using size 4. About halfway through this layer, we will pause our pinks and switch to yellow, cover a few petals to create a warm glow. This is called an underpainting. And then when our underpainting is dry, proceed to cover the rest of the petals with pink. Our second layer will focus on defining larger areas of shadow. I call it a definition layer, and you will start seeing the shape of each petal emerge. We will use our entire range of pinks, reds, and violets here. And you will see a section of my reference photo on the left so you can see exactly how I choose my pigments. I will explain what I see and how I put down my strokes. Try to follow along, but loosely. I want you to consider the reference photo and recognize the areas of light and shadow on each petal. If you're hesitant to go with your brush right away on some of the larger shadows, you may outline these shadows with a pencil first. Just make sure to use a very light, hard pencil, 2H or 4H, so that your pencil marks are barely visible. Then we will erase the masking fluid and paint the stamens and the stem. Feel free to stop at this point. Your flower should look fairly real. Of course, there's always an opportunity to add more definition, so you may choose to go all the way with me and follow me through to layer 3 as we accentuate some of the shadows and add some texture to the petals. We will have an opportunity to create more contrast and add vibrancy. But this last layer is more of a stylistic preference. It's not entirely necessary, but I know that most of my followers want to know how I achieve that highly detailed, vibrant look. So you can follow me along to see how these high definition details are created. For the second and third layer, we will be using a finer brush. I'm using size 2 round brush, or you can just use a tip of your larger brush if you're using the same brush as you did in the first layer. And we will only use wet on dry technique, meaning we will be applying colors with a wet brush on top of the layer that's completely dry. It's a more controlled way of painting, and we will be defining our smaller shadows. So let's get started. And our first task will be nailing our background layer and following to the definition layers. And you will be able to do all those lovely details. Trust the process, focus on one petal at a time. And if the shadows look too complicated or too intricate, simplify them, combine them together as much as possible. You will see me do this quite often. See if you can relax your sense of discreteness of these petals and just consider areas of light and dark. Alternatively, of course, you can just follow my exact strokes. I want you to be comfortable above all else. So use as little or as much guidance from me as possible, and as much or as little detail as you feel comfortable with. Before we get get started with our masking fluid or our paints, if you're going straight to painting, just a quick note about an outline. So I saved a black and white outline of this peony, and you can download it from the class resources section and just trace it. The art of drawing, accurate sketching is an entirely different set of skills, and we're not focusing on that today. I really want you to focus on practicing watercolor skills. So download the outline and use your preferred method of tracing, a light box, a window, or graphite paper. And of course, you can simply draw the outline the way I did directly on the paper. And just know that as I was drawing, I've simplified some of the shapes, getting rid of some of the petals so that we can focus on larger areas of light and shadow. So looking at your reference photo, find your yellow stamens and paint them with masking fluid. Just cover the entire surface of the stamen. You'll notice that the tips are kind of fat and elongated, and then they're the stems that lead towards the center of the flower. So you can paint those with the tip of your applicator towards the center of the flower. You have one cluster on the left, another cluster in the middle, and I will show you at a different angle what my final result looks like. Don't worry about getting it 100% accurately. Just paint a couple of stamens where you see fit, or you can zoom in on your reference photo and get more detailed. There's one or two sticking out here and another one over here, and that's about it. This is what it looks like in the end, and this will really help us achieve a sense of realism. If you don't have masking fluid, just try to paint around those clusters. We are about to start our first layer of color. I'm so excited, and I hope you are too. If you're a little nervous, it's totally okay. Just trust the process. It may look like a long road ahead. For this first layer, we'll likely need about an hour plus the drying time. So review the process overview video if you need to, but I'll give you a quick refresh before we start. Our objective is to cover the entire area of the peony with our first very light wash. So make sure to use very diluted pigments. We will need 2 main pigments. The rest is optional, but will be helpful. Your base pink, and you may want to pre-mix it ahead of time. Keep it very light. And your purple, again, pre-mix ahead of time so you have the same saturation throughout. Supporting pigments we will need are red, and you can use quinacridone red like I did, or carmine, and we will use it on those petals where the inside roots are visible. Violet, and it's for those petals where we see the lower back at the root. And warm yellow. We will paint this layer petal by petal, following the exact same process on each petal. This is what will make it more straightforward and more predictable. We'll start with a little bit of purple just below the top edge, where the petal is very thin and is letting the sun through. We'll blend it up with clear water towards the edge, then blend it down with our base pink all the way down. There will be some petals where the entire root of the petal will be visible, and we want to have more saturation there. So let's use some violet if you see the outer side of the petal, and let's use some deep red if you see the inner side. Essentially, this area on the inside of the flower where the roots of each petal are visible and are getting some warm backlight, we will need some more warm red there. The yellow underpainting layer we'll do separately. I did it halfway through, so that's the sequence we will use. That is all. Although we have lots of petals, the process for the most part is the same with some slight variations. If you skip some of the parts, don't worry, we will have a chance to fix them in the next layer and the next layer. Just focus on creating full coverage of pink with some shadow areas and keep it super light for now. So, just as I described a minute ago, we'll start with a little bit of purple, just below the tips of the petal and blend it up with clear water so the tip is basically white. And then we're going to blend it down with our base pink, and I'm using opera pink, all the way down to the root of the petal, or as far as we can see because it's covered by another petal. My strokes are very slow and precise. I want to make sure that I follow the shape of the petal, and my mixture of pink is very light for the most part. Okay, just that tip up on top and blend it up with clear water. Now let's work on the next petal. Again, the process is the same. Start with a super light purple mixture and blend it down with pink, just following the outline. And as you can see, my outlines are quite light, but I can still see the shape of the petal clearly. Make sure I didn't miss anything and move on to the next petal. Start with purple, blend up with clear water, follow with pink. See, it's the same process, it's just maybe a little bit tedious, but it will be worth it in the end. Let's do another one. Here it's a bit more complicated because there are lots of highlights, so I'm just trying to paint the tip purple but leave a couple of spots blank. Don't worry if you miss them. It will not interfere much with the effect. It's just a way to add more detail. And I'm going to blend it down with my pink all the way. Maybe add a bit more saturation there as the petal goes down. Notice that my strokes for the most part are going in the direction of the petal, so top down from the tip to the root. And that's just in case we leave some more saturated marks. You notice that I just added a little bit of violet all the way at the root. And now the next small petal, the tip is purple, going down with pink, leaving a little spot, a little highlight blank. And now the next one, notice that I'm choosing petals that are not touching, and that's just to save some time. I don't want to go in order because I want them to be separated at this point for the most part, and I just want to focus on one petal at a time. Another petal. This one is quite dark in the reference photo, but don't worry about making it much darker at this point. We will come back to it again and again with our shadow pigments and our boost pigments. Another petal, same principle, purple, then pink. Now let's switch back to the left. At this point, the first petals I've painted are dry, so I can work on the one in between here. Purple and then pink. Gently all the way down. See, I'm not interfering with the tip of that petal at the bottom because it's dry. If it wasn't, it would bleed. So make sure that when you're painting a petal that the ones surrounding it are completely dry. And I just added some violet at the base. Let's finish off this petal, starting with very light purple and then going with pink all the way down, and maybe a bit more violet all the way down at the base just to add more saturation. I'm going to come back to the left right here, dry my brush on tissue paper, and when it's dry just lift a little bit of paint to create a highlight because I feel like I've put too much color there. And now let's do the back of this petal, just a small section. No bright highlights there, just purple on the edge, pink all the way down and to the left. And now let's work on this large petal. We see the inside of this petal. It's a bit more complicated compared to others. It has two pieces kind of sticking out and curving towards the center. So what I'm going to do is put light purple towards the tip and also a little bit in the middle maybe, and then go with pink all around and fill in the rest of the area. Note that I'm leaving the tips of those two curved parts blank. They're kind of receiving more light, and so just leave them blank for now. It will help us when we come back later to add more pigment. It will help us recognize the shape and have more definition there. And I'm just going to use dry brush method again and lift 2 highlights there. Lift a little bit of paint. Just use a wet brush and pat it on your tissue paper to get rid of almost all the water, and then just drag it where you see the highlight. Now I'm going to use my pink to go all the way down towards the center of the flower, just blending it down and gently switching to my violet. You can see that area inside the flower. It's a lot darker in the reference photo because it's in the shadow. It's not receiving any direct sunlight. So we want to make sure we kind of prep it, but we don't want to go with too much of a saturated pigment because there's going to be lots and lots of layers and lots of shadows and petal details. So let's just maybe give it a little bit of a boost compared to other light pink areas with some violet, and going down I'm using quinacridone red, but not too saturated. So just maybe a shade darker than the petals that are facing the light. Here I'm dropping some quinacridone red just very gently around the stamens, wet on wet. Let it dry and move on to the next petal. Now this one we painted the back of it. Now it's dry. Make sure that that fold is dry, and let's paint it. But this time I don't think I'm gonna use much purple on top, on the tip. I don't see much purple there because it's sort of facing towards the sun in some areas. So I'm just gonna do clear water at the tip and then pink all the way down, and a little bit of violet at the root. There's also a very strong shadow there, so more violet in that area. And we're doing it wet on wet, so it's sort of blended right now with the rest of the pink color, but don't worry about it. We will come back at the right time to add more definition to that shadow and create a stronger silhouette. For now, we're just doing sort of a very basic guiding background color, so don't worry about being super precise at this point. Just keep following the same process. Purple at the tip, pink all the way down, and blending it up with clear water, petal by petal. Trust the process. We will create more definition as we move along with this class. And this is key because creating layers of color step by step will help us achieve that realistic effect. We can't do this right away in one layer. We want to build our layers, build our saturation, add our shadows step by step. Just did a small petal in the middle with pink as a base, and then quinacridone red at the root and at the tip. Now let's go to this petal over here. We painted the back of it. Now let's paint the middle. Right here, starting with my pink and blending it up with clear water. Don't see a lot of purple there. Continue outlining it. There's a little piece visible here through the folds. Again, just using pink. We will come back to it later again and again to achieve a more realistic color. For now, I'm just going to blend it further towards the base of the petal with my violet, and then switching to pink again. There's kind of a shadow there, so I just want to gently mark that spot. Put a little bit more pink on those small pieces that are visible between the petals, and finish off with that little tip sticking out. It's quite obvious that it has purple, so I'm going to start with that and then continue with pink all the way down. Bit more saturated compared to the parts of the petal that are around. And then all the way down, there's a piece visible there, so just more saturated pink. Now let's do this small petal that's stuck in between two clusters of stamens. I'll just go with pink. I don't think I'm going to use much purple there. Blend that highlight with dry brush just to leave a little bit of a blank spot, and add a little bit of warm red at the tip. I'm not worried about covering my stamens because they're covered with masking fluid, so just painting over them. And now let's do this small edge, the back of this petal, with some pink, blend it with clear water. Another small piece over here, again just a little bit of pink, leaving the very edge of the tip white. Another small piece. Now we're mostly done with large petals. We're just going over and covering smaller areas, mostly pink. You don't have to overcomplicate it at this point. We will come back to paint the details later. And this part here, I'm actually going to go with purple at the tips. Looking at the reference photo, it's quite saturated, so let's add more vibrant pink to blend it down. Vibrant, but not all saturated to the full extent, to the full potential of our pink, just maybe a shade darker than the petals surrounding it. And I'm just cleaning up the edges and bringing my color down. Super warm and saturated there, so I'm gonna go with some violet there. Cleaning the edge very gently, making sure that I've covered everything. And now I'm gonna add warm red, wet on wet. Notice the strokes are going in the direction of the petal, so from the root all the way to the tip. That's very important because if there are any streaks left, they will mimic the texture of the petal, and that's a good thing. Now let's do the back of this petal. Purple on top, and then blending it with pink. It's going to be much darker when we're done with it, but for now keep it light. Again, just follow the same principle. This is our background layer. We don't need to have a lot of pigment at this stage. I'm going to go around the flower now and look for some smaller petal pieces that we may have left out. I will paint them with my pink and sometimes purple, depending on what I see in the reference photo. I will leave these 5 large petals facing us completely blank for now. We will work on them in the next video. I'm leaving them blank to give us a chance to add a yellow underpainting first. So note the petals I'm leaving blank and finish the rest of the peony. This little piece right here, I think I will use magenta. It looks very dark on the reference photo, and so no reason to go with light pink first. And now that most of the petals are covered with our base pink wash, let's move on to the next video.